Thanks very much. I'd like to thank Kim and Alfonso for the great invitation to come to this really important meeting. And I'm very thankful to be a speaker because it means I can take off my mask and I can, it's hot in there. Okay, so before I start my talk, I just want to have a comment on André Picard's talk about the difficulties of getting science implemented in policy. And I went to a policy workshop a couple of years ago before COVID. And somebody who was on the panel, who had been in government for many years, looked at all of us scientists and in the audience and said, you want change? Go into politics yourself. What we need are smart people who understand science to go into politics. So I'm gonna pay that forward to y'all. All right, so on March 23rd, 2020, I got an email from somebody I didn't know, had never met before, a woman named Katya, who was writing to me from New York City. And if you can think back to March 23rd, 2020, when the refrigerator trucks were parked outside hospitals for all of the victims of COVID, she wrote me this. When I was a student in the university, I learned about your study of prenatal maternal stress during the ice storm in Quebec and the development of the children. Is it possible that the stress from the pandemic could influence the development of my child? She was pregnant and very worried, especially that her husband would not be able to be with her while she was giving birth. So what prompted her to send me this question? And why, in the first place, was I even studying stress during pregnancy? So as a researcher and as a researcher at the Douglas Hospital Research Center, which is a psychiatric hospital in Verdun, I was very interested in schizophrenia and understanding the origins of severe mental illness. And the reason I was interested in looking at stress and pregnancy was based on, I'll just give you two examples of studies that look at first schizophrenia and the second one at autism. So one of the studies that had influenced me a great deal was this one that followed up on the invasion of Holland in World War II, which happened on May 10th, 1940, in which the Germans invaded, and especially in Rotterdam was bombed. They were about destroying 24,000 houses. There were 2,220 soldiers that died, 2,000 civilians, so a major stressor. So these two researchers, Jim Van Oss and Jean-Pierre Selten, went back in time from 1998. They said, we're going to go back and we're going to look in the psychiatric records in the Netherlands to see if the stress of the invasion of Holland changed the risk for schizophrenia in people who were in utero at that time. And in fact, what they found, if you're not familiar, schizophrenia has a prevalence around the world of about 1%. But for people who had been exposed in utero, there was a 1.15 risk of schizophrenia. So risk increased by 15% for people who had been in utero on May 10th, 1940. For people who had been in their first trimester, there was a 28% increase in risk. For those who were males in their second trimester, risk increased by 35%, and then there was no increase in risk for those who had been exposed in their third trimester. So this was a very important study that kind of launched me on my prenatal stress research. So another study that was interesting, also again looking at, or this time looking at something that's related to climate change, which is hurricanes, was a study by Dennis Kinney. He was looking at the prevalence rate of autism in the state of Louisiana. So the normal prevalence rate is about 5.2 per 10,000 births. What he did was he looked back in time and he found that there had been 10 tropical storms or hurricanes between 1980 and 1995. And the severity of these storms were rated by the National Weather Service. He didn't do it himself as a psychologist, but used the severity of these storms. So he had a couple of hypotheses. The first one was that the more severe the storm, the greater would be the increase in prevalence of autism in the state. And so, as you can see here, remember, prevalence is usually about 5. So when there was no hurricane or tropical storm, that's what we got. But then the risk increased to about 6 per 10,000 births, and then up to 13 per 10,000 births with a high severity storm. He also, looking at other research, he hypothesized that the most riskiest time in pregnancy would be mid-gestation and late gestation. And indeed, so these are the months of pregnancy. This is the increase in risk and prevalence. And we can see that especially mid-gestation for people who had been in utero during a tropical storm or hurricane in mid-gestation, so the prevalence had gone up to 17 or 18 per 10,000 births. So what this suggests is that there's something about the timing in pregnancy of a major stressor on the pregnant woman, but also kind of a dose response to the severity of that stress. And so one could hypothesize that if you put those two together and look at the interaction, that you would find something even more important. And in fact, what he found was looking at the severity of these storms from low, mediate to high, and then looking at the timing. So this red line is the prevalence of autism for people who were exposed either in months 5 and 6 or 9 and 10 of pregnancy. And you can see that, remember, the usual prevalence is 5 per 10,000, but it goes up to 26 per 10,000 births for kids who had been in utero in months 5, 6, or 9, 10 during a severe hurricane. So what we see here is that there's dose response, there's the importance of timing in utero, but how do we think about how this works? So the conventional wisdom had been for a very long time that the fetus is a perfect parasite. It's inside the uterus, it's enveloped in fluid, can't hear anything, can't see anything, and that in fact, being the perfect parasite, the fetus will take whatever it needs for itself, whatever nutrients or vitamins or whatever it needs, it will take from the mother, even if it's to the mother's detriment. Well, this thought has been replaced by something called fetal programming, or DOHAD, which stands for the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. And the whole idea is that the placenta is a bit like a sensory organ. You know, we've got our eyes to keep us from tripping over things in the environment. Well, the placenta is there to capture the environment of the mother and potentially to alter the development of the fetus in ways that are supposed to, anyway, are supposed to enhance at least short-term survival, even if it's at the detriment to long-term health and well-being. So let's say, for example, that a pregnant woman is in the wildfires in Fort McMurray in 2016. That stress is going to be communicated to the fetus and potentially change it in certain ways. And this is all well and good, except for that when that baby is born, maybe there is no more stress, and now it's maladapted to its environment. So we talk a lot about stress. I think Kim has said the word stress maybe 16 times since I've been here, but what do we mean by stress? You know, everybody kind of has an idea, but I think it's important to really break stress down into its elements. And so this model of stress by Lazarus and Folkman suggests that you might start with some kind of objective situation or an event that will then be followed by a cognitive appraisal, kind of 2 stages. And the first stage being, is this event a threat to me? If the person decides that no, it's not a threat to me, then there's no stress. If they say, well, yes, it is a threat to me, then they go on to the second stage of cognitive appraisal, which is to weigh their own resources and ability to cope with that threat. And if they think, okay, it is a threat, but I can cope, well, then it's kind of a positive stress. Yes, it is a threat, but no, I don't think I have the resources to cope. Then that's negative stress. That creates subjective distress, which can lead to an activation of the HPA axis and send cortisol streaming throughout the body. Well, that's all well and good for fight and flight, but if a woman is pregnant, that cortisol can go through the placenta, overwhelming. There's a barrier enzyme in the placenta, 11-beta-HSD2, which normally converts the cortisol into cortisone, but that breaks down when stress is very high, and that can get through and program the development of the fetus. But how do you study a thing like this? Especially because so many of the events that might happen to a pregnant woman are things that she could potentially have contributed to herself, either by her depression or her anxiety. Also, the father of the child also could contribute to these. So how do you tease all of these things apart? Well, in order to gain a better understanding of prenatal maternal stress in humans, I mean, we can do it very well in animals, but to study it in humans, you need some kind of a major stressor that occurs to pregnant humans, has to be outside the woman's control, and as much as possible, the stress randomly distributed. Needs to be applied to large numbers of pregnant women so that we can do the statistics we need to do. Needs to affect women in varying degrees so that we can look at this dose-response effect. It needs to affect women at various stages of pregnancy so that we can look at the timing effect. And it needs to be the kind of event that will allow the researchers to get in there and assess the level of exposure and the woman's reactions as soon as possible after the event. And this is where the ice storm comes in. So for anybody who wasn't there, there was maybe a 2-degree increase in temperature in the first week of January 1998, which rather than having a snowstorm led to actually a series of ice storms with freezing rain moving through southern Quebec. So the weight of the ice toppled basically the electrical grid, leaving 3 million Quebecers without electricity, some for as long as 45 days. So there were 454 shelters that were established. They housed as many as 17,000 people on a single night. The economic costs were the worst of any disaster in Canadian history at that point, at $1.5 billion. There were 27 deaths that were attributed either directly or indirectly to the ice storm. So we started Project Ice Storm as soon as we could following the ice storm. And on June 1st, 1998, I sent out questionnaires to women that their doctors had identified as being pregnant during the ice storm or in the 3 months following the ice storm. And so I created questionnaires that I thought would capture these various elements of stress. So in the natural disaster literature, when they talk about measuring exposure, they look at several different categories of exposure, including the level of threat, the loss, the scope, which is either the duration or the density of the exposure, and the amount of change. For cognitive appraisal, I hadn't actually read Lazarus and Folkman when I created the questionnaire, but I went back and I looked to see what might be in the questionnaire that would be as close as possible. So there was this one item, taking into account all of the effects of the disaster on you and your family, what would you say have been the overall consequences of the disaster? And women could indicate from very negative to very positive. And I was quite surprised when the data came back that as many women found the ice storm a positive event as found it a negative event. And very often it was because they wrote in stories, right, about how they had been at their in-laws and they got to know their in-laws better. There was no, maybe there was no electricity, so they played games, they talked, they shared stories, and it was a fun time. We also looked at subjective distress. And something that I perhaps wouldn't do again is to rely on a questionnaire of post-traumatic stress type symptoms. So we use the impact of events scale revised, which has 3 categories. You know, I avoid thinking about the ice storm. I have intrusive thoughts about the ice storm or images. And when I think about the ice storm, I get hyper aroused with my heartbeats and so on. So after the ice storm, I included in other studies 2 scales of what we call peritraumatic stress. So here it is 6 months after a disaster. Now think back to what you felt at the time of the disaster and what was your level of distress and your level of dissociation. So after the ice storm, I started using those 2 questionnaires. And then, of course, looking at timing. So one of the advantages of looking at a natural disaster is that we know exactly the date that the timing started. If you're looking at a life event like the death of a parent, well, when did it actually start, right? We know the day they died, but that this is very often an ongoing chronic trauma. So once we recruited our women and got this information, we've been following them up relentlessly over the years. So a lot of lab visits, some postal questionnaires, structural MRIs of the brain, also of the gonads. We got a blood draw from the kids at age 13. We had a control group of children from the same schools that were born the year before the ice storm. So we have a lot of data. And by the way, if anybody needs a project, I've got the data for you. So give me a call. So the ice storm was fantastic, but I thought, you know, what about other disasters? Would we see the same thing? So I followed up the ice storm in 1998, 10 years later, with a study of women who were pregnant during the floods in Iowa in 2008. What we really wanted was to get samples of the placentas, but we never got the money in time. So 3 years later, when they had flooding in Queensland, Australia, we used the money from the grant that we got for Iowa to go right over there to Australia and collect placenta samples, which are currently being analyzed at UBC. We wanted also to be able to do something. Now that we had like 3 studies that showed that there were effects, what could we do? So in 2016, following the Fort McMurray wildfires, David Olson twisted my arm and got me involved in a study there of women who were pregnant, and we included a randomized control trial of an online intervention that we hoped would make a difference. But the numbers were too small, so the next year there was major flooding in Houston following Hurricane Harvey. I threw all my eggs in that basket. We recruited 1,000 women, redid the randomized control trial. And then now I've also been involved in 3 different studies of COVID. So the main idea of this whole program of research is that these different aspects of prenatal maternal stress will have influence on a variety of outcomes in child development. We can look at what might be the moderators of those effects, what might be the effects on maternal mental health, which might also actually be a mediator of effects on the child outcomes, what might also be mediators through the child in terms of their brain development and so on. So let's look at maternal mental health and in particular looking at their trauma reactions, PTSD. So definitely the worst disaster that I've looked at so far is the Fort McMurray wildfires in 2016, where the rates of PTSD are just through the roof, like half of the sample meets criteria for this cutoff. When we gave them the questionnaire, we asked them one question. One of the questions that we asked is a resilience question. When something bad happens, I find it very difficult to bounce back quickly. And we found that single question explained a lot of variance and interacted with their level of objective stress. You know, we had a questionnaire about the threat, loss, scope, and change. And here we see that when the objective stress was relatively low, that it was clear that women who had rated themselves as being low on resilience had significantly higher post-traumatic stress-like symptoms. But those women stayed, it didn't much matter what they went through. in terms of their objective stress. They were just always fairly high. So a score of 20 is it's kind of getting up there to being a criterion. Whereas the women who said that they had very good resilience, they actually were quite responsive to the level of objective stress. So when objective stress was low, they were definitely having low levels of PTSD symptoms, but the levels of stress from that Fort McMurray wildfire were so high that it didn't protect them very much at high levels. Another thing that she looked at, Barbara Verstraeten at University of Alberta, was this cognitive appraisal item. You'll recall what were the consequences of the disaster on you and your family, and she looked at those who said it was negative, those who said it was either neutral or positive. And here we saw that really it was for those who had a negative cognitive appraisal of the wildfire that were very susceptible to the level of objective stress, and their levels of PTSD symptoms were rising above the cutoff. Whereas those with a positive appraisal, somehow their levels of PTSD were reduced over time. So there's something interesting going on with this cognitive appraisal and objective hardship. A young psychiatrist who's working with me, Vincent Paquin, looked at our data from Australia, and he looked at the women's levels of depression postpartum, so from 16 months to 30 months to 4 years to 6 years over time. So the y-axis is kind of a composite of their levels of depression over time. And once again, we're seeing that the women who had a negative cognitive appraisal of the flooding, that they were very responsive to the level of distress that they had had at the time, whereas women with a positive cognitive appraisal were protected. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of resilience, is that some resilience can actually come from within the person, from their psychological attitudes. And actually, if you know anything about cognitive behavior therapy, one of the techniques is cognitive reframing, to think again about the situation that you're in as a way of overcoming it. Resilience might also come from policy. So in Australia, my colleague Sue Kildare has been fighting for years to have something called group midwifery practice become the policy. Because in Australia, all babies are born with midwives in hospitals. It's not nurses, it's midwives. But during the pregnancy, when you go to the clinic, you could be met by any midwife who happens to be there. So over time, you may never see the same midwife twice, and at the birth might be assisted by a midwife that you'd never met. Whereas in group midwifery practice, you're in a small group of maybe 3 or 4, you have a primary midwife. And so what we found was and here again we're looking at postpartum depression, that for the women who were in the group midwifery practice, they were completely buffered from the effects of the objective hardship from the flooding. And some of these women lost their homes. I mean, the floods were not that much fun. They were completely buffered, and probably from the support that they had, whereas the women who were in that standard care were very much subject to those levels of stress. So if we look now at the effects on the unborn child. So as you would have seen, we've been following those kids from Project Ice Storm all the way to the age of 19. And the timing in pregnancy has effects, the objective hardship, the subjective distress, the cognitive appraisal. We have effects on everything that we've ever looked at in terms of motor development, cognitive development, physical, and I missed something, behavioral development. Everything we looked at, we found something, and sometimes even the effects increase the older the kids get. So I have a student, Sandra Lafortune. She's defending her thesis next week. She's published a meta-analysis on all the disaster studies of on the effects of prenatal stress on the unborn children, and found that the objective hardship really is quite impressive in its effect on cognitive, motor, physical, social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. Subjective distress, kind of less so in some areas, and the cognitive appraisal doesn't have much of a main effect, but it actually has quite an effect on mediation and as a moderator. In fact, cognitive appraisal explains or is the most highly correlated with DNA methylation in the kids at age 13, where subjective distress is not. She also found that the ice storm, in particular, had the highest effects on child development. So that's something to look into. So again, in terms of child development and looking at policy, this group midwifery practice not only had effects of protecting the pregnant woman from depression and anxiety postpartum, it also had significant effects on the child's development at 6 months of age, especially in motor and problem solving. So what's good for the mom seems to be also good for the child. We also have studies, this one is from the Australian floods, showing that the way in which the mother parents the young child, something called maternal structuring or emotional availability with the infant, protects that child from the effects of peritraumatic distress on their cognitive development. I know I'm going fast, I'm afraid I don't want to go too long. And from the Iowa flood study, another student who graduated last year has shown that more consistent discipline also is protecting the child from the effects of the prenatal stress. I know that's fast and I'm not explaining every one, but you're getting the idea. So what about COVID? Can we consider it a natural disaster? Well, if you think about the levels of threat, the levels of loss, the amount of change, the scope, I mean, it's just never ending, it's going on, and it's pretty normal to have some subjective distress. So I've been involved in a few different studies, one with my former colleagues from Australia, from the flood, and I want to mention, because resilience is kind of a theme, I just want to mention that we included 3 simple items. We included that cognitive appraisal item. Overall, what would you say were the consequences of COVID on you and your household? We had a single item on resilience. When things go wrong in my life, it generally takes me a long time to get back to normal. And tolerance of uncertainty. So in Andre Picard's talk, he mentioned that uncertainty is very unsettling. So we've got several thousand women in this study from Australia, and we looked at maternal anxiety at 2 months. And every one of those items significantly buffered the women from anxiety at 2 months. So the red line down here, that this is women who said that they had high resilience. Down here is women who said that they had a good tolerance of uncertainty. And the red line down here, women whose cognitive appraisal was positive. They were all buffered. So, take-home messages. There are big advantages of looking at natural disasters to study stress, because you can really break it down into its elements, and you have perfect timing. Using multiple disasters allows us to replicate what we find from one disaster to the next. Stress in pregnancy can lead to both postpartum mental health problems for the mom. For the child, there is a small but lasting effect on the unborn child. We have seen, for example, the effects of the objective hardship from the ice storm, like the number of days without electricity, is still predicting BMI in those kids in late adolescence, higher BMI, but also more severe autistic-like traits in those kids. And then it's not just, stress is not just distress, that we have to start taking seriously the actual objective hardship that people go through. It's not just how upset they are. And that resilience against trauma can come from within, like cognitive appraisal, tolerance of uncertainty, your own sense of resilience, but also from outside. I didn't show you, but social support is buffering, prenatal care, and parenting. How am I doing on time? I'm over, aren't I? Okay. So I'll just stop there and say thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. King. In the interest of time, we will go to our next speaker, who's actually going to be joining Zoom. This is the wonders of technology today. So over to you, Dr. Hayes.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for allowing me to join virtually. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, so very much appreciate the opportunity to connect with you all. So I'm going to explore the research that I've conducted on mental health in a changing climate. So when we think about our mental health, I think it's important to firstly talk about what we mean. So our mental health, just like our physical health, exists on a continuum. At times we might be thriving, and other times we might be struggling or in a crisis. And when we think about how we feel in a changing climate, at times we might be experiencing mental wellness. Maybe we're engaging in community with climate active behavior, in terms of climate mitigation or climate adaptation. At other times, you might be experiencing mental problems, feeling anxious. The terms climate anxiety often come up, or climate grief. Normal, non-pathological experiences to exposure to the climate change issue. And at other times, we might be experiencing mental illness, and this can occur after experiencing extreme weather events like floods or hurricanes or wildfires. And just as Dr. King had mentioned, noticing the increase in post-traumatic stress after these events. There are also, it's important to talk about how our place and culture shape our experiences of health. So really looking at the psychosocial components of how climate change affects our psychosocial well-being. So an example of this would be experiencing pervasive drought, for example. And we know that pervasive drought can lead to resource scarcity. So food and water become scarce. This can lead to population displacement. This can also lead to violence, intergroup conflict, which also, of course, has impacts on overall well-being at the community level and at the individual level. So much of what I'm going to be presenting to you today can be found in the Mental Health and Wellbeing chapter of the Health of Canadians in a Changing Climate report. So this was published by Health Canada in February 9th, I believe. And for the first time, we had a dedicated chapter on the mental health and wellbeing impacts of a changing climate. And what we describe in the chapter is really that, the impacts from climate change could occur in that it could exacerbate existing mental illnesses. It could create new onset illnesses such as PTSD. We may experience mental health stressors such as grief, worry, vicarious trauma. We may occur a lost sense of place, affecting our communities, our ability to work or travel to and from work. It can disrupt our ability to be resilient and from our psychosocial well-being. Many communities who have been on the front lines and have experienced numerous climate-related events often have their resilience tested time and time again. It could disrupt a sense of meaning in one's life, particularly again, if work or family or community connection has been disrupted. We've seen higher rates of hospital admissions. In the research, there's also evidence of increased suicidal ideation or suicide, particularly related to extreme heat, and other increased negative behaviors such as substance misuse, violence, and aggression. And we know that our mental health and our physical health and our community health are all connected. So this is an important starting point when we think about the impacts to our mental health. And in the Canadian context, some of the most frequent types of climate-related causes that can affect our mental health are increased frequency and severity of precipitation. So that can include ice storms, flooding, hurricanes. We also have seen droughts impacting mental health, wildfires, extreme temperature, decreased food and water security, melting permafrost, sea level rise, and gradual warming. And the whole host of outcomes that I've mentioned on this slide earlier, but some important things to highlight here. While there are a whole host of negative mental health outcomes that can occur, PTSD, depression, suicidal ideation, recovery fatigue, there are also times when communities band together, and that sense of community can be wrapped up in feeling altruism, compassion for one another, and what's often termed as post-traumatic growth, or a sense of meaning in a person's life. And this can be very confusing for people because these emotional states and behavioral states can co-occur with some of these negative mental health effects as well. So I was really curious about looking towards how we could include mental health into climate change and health vulnerability and adaptation assessments. Climate change and health vulnerability and adaptation assessments are tools that are often used by public health authorities across the country who are really curious about documenting the risks, the impacts, and the adaptation opportunities. And I was always curious as to why mental health wasn't always factored in a substantive way. So what myself and my co-authors did is we took a look at the global research on climate-related hazards, looked at who was most at risk, and of course found that those who are most at risk are those who are already facing health inequities. And this is something I'm going to talk about a little bit more later on. And then we find the potential mental health outcomes and how they've been measured or monitored, often through the use of surveys, patient records, looking at emergency department visits, reviewing new prescription drug use. So this was used after the Southern Alberta floods in 2013. Researchers went into the community and found that there was an increase in sleeping aids and anti-anxiety medications. And of course, also conducting interviews, so the qualitative components as well, conducting interviews with folks. We know that the stigma of mental illness is alive and well, and oftentimes people may feel stigmatized to self-report about their mental health indicators on surveys, and sometimes through the use of qualitative interviews, it might be a bit of an easier way for researchers to get a sense from their participants about the distress or impacts to their well-being that people may experience. And in looking at how climate change impacts mental health and how we can observe it and measure and monitor it, there are a few key considerations and challenges to the data collection. Firstly, attributing environmental hazards to climate change, so that attribution challenge comes in, and then attributing mental health outcomes to these hazards. And then, of course, isolating the specific mental health outcomes from climate change to other compounding life stressors that we might be experiencing. We're all experiencing the global pandemic right now. So too, we're experiencing issues of systemic racism and violence in communities, and then our own individual stressors. And so parsing out the specific climate-related outcomes can be challenging. And it's also important to measure some types of mental health impacts and compounding stressors, particularly for frontline communities like Indigenous peoples, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations communities who may also be experiencing intergenerational trauma, colonialism, and connectedness to the land. And we also want to study that in combination with climate change impacts. And then also looking at how, when we study and report on mental health indicators, when mental health can be understood differently amongst diverse populations. And so really, again, making sure that we have a better understanding of what mental health means to communities and people. And so mental health may mean spiritual connectedness, it may mean community health, and it may mean a whole host of other health indicators to take into consideration. And then there are issues of under or over-reporting mental health outcomes related to climate change. So under-reporting can occur, as I mentioned earlier, due to the stigma of mental illness. So people may be reluctant to self-report on their mental health after exposure to a climate-related event. And over-reporting may occur if researchers go into the field too soon after, when we're seeing normal responses to a disaster event, and maybe over-reporting on the number of people who might be experiencing distress or depression related to the event. It's really taking a longer term view of what some of these outcomes may be. And it's also important to consider that there are indirect mental health effects of exposure to climate hazards. So this slide here demonstrates a study from the UK that looked at post-flooding increases in PTSD, anxiety, and depression amongst populations. Interestingly, they also found that people who were disrupted by the flood, maybe it impacted their ability to seek healthcare or go to work or go to school, or it affected their community or their neighbors or loved ones, but they hadn't directly experienced it to their homes or their workplaces. They also experienced PTSD, anxiety, and depression, just at a lesser degree than those who were directly impacted. And as I mentioned, I really wanted to make sure that we're exploring how this is climate change impacts to mental health is a health equity issue, and really exploring the inequitable burden. So we know that those who are experiencing poor mental health outcomes related to climate change are experiencing health inequities in general based on social, ecological, cultural, economic determinants of health. And these can intersect and interact. So we know that a woman living in a frontline community who's experienced climate-related disasters time and time again, who perhaps also has a pre-existing physical or mental health condition, will fare worse after a climate-related disaster based on these compounding determinants of health. And when we look at who's at risk in Canada, so this again comes from that climate change and health report published by Health Canada, and looking at the mental health impacts, the inequitable mental health impacts, we see that our Indigenous peoples, women, children and youth, older adults, people living in low socioeconomic conditions, people with pre-existing mental or physical health conditions, and certain occupational groups, particularly land-based workers, land or water-based workers, and also first responders who are coming time and time again to these events. And I think another group that we could add based on the opening remarks of Andre Picard is really, you know, the media who's going in and being exposed to these events time and time again as well. And when we talk about impacts to people who identify as women, it's important to note that in the research, we often see that women tend to be more prone to anxiety, worry, PTSD related to changing climate, and that women also tend to be in caregiving roles, which tend to be undervalued and underpaid. And they're at greater risk of experiencing things like compassion fatigue, particularly during exposure of climate hazards. I do want to caveat this, though, that women tend to be socialized to talk more about their mental health and well-being. So it's not to say that people who identify as men aren't experiencing it, but just to note that there is a factor in there that socializing how and when we talk about our mental health and who talks about their mental health is also an important consideration. Now let's take a look at some of the overarching pieces in terms of the psychosocial health impacts, climate displacement and distress. So displacement related to climate change, the most commonly cited projection is about 200 million by 2050. And the International Organization for Migrants has reported that displacement from environmental conflicts is now more common than displacement from violence and conflict. And Kari Gibson out of Australia noted that one particular space and place to take a look at climate-related distress is the low-lying Pacific nation of Tuvalu. And what her and her colleagues found was that distress related to displacement was really also wrapped up in distress related to loss of culture. There could be family conflict, financial hardships, and impacts to future generations, and really noting that point of a lost sense of culture and place and meaning in people's lives. We know too that people who have been displaced can experience unwelcoming host environments and experience racism and discrimination, which have dire effects on community mental health and individual mental health and well-being. And two, there are populations who may want to migrate, but are trapped due to social, political, and economic conditions. And this also has dire consequences on community well-being. When we think about displacement or migration related to climate disasters or climate-related events, it's important to know that this can be considered an adaptive response, adapting to a new host environment to protect population-level health and well-being. However, there are conditions that need to ensure that it is a positive psychosocial outcome, and there are certain conditions that underlie this. So, making sure that if displacement needs to take place or people are migrating due to climate change, it needs to be voluntary, consented to, considered a last resort, well planned, and improves the standard of living. And we know, and as we've seen through many disasters, that when displacement or migration occurs, that these conditions are not necessarily met. It's something that has occurred in a space of an emergency, and again can lead to longer lasting challenges for people. Particularly what we've seen in the research, and here's one example, in 2011, the Manitoba floods displaced residents of Lake St. Martin First Nation for over 6 years. Approximately 7% of the evacuees never returned home, and many were due to cases of homelessness and suicide. So these longer term effects related to displacement and that can wreak havoc on community and individual mental health. So when we think about climate change, we often hear about a lot of new terminology, things like eco-grief or climate grief or eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. So these are terms that researchers are using to describe the relationship that people may be experiencing between their well-being and a changing environment. They're not pathological disorders. You're not going to find them in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, but rather, again, they're terms used to describe experiences that many people are having right now and that are distressing. So things like climate anxiety is our worry or grief for our current experiences of climate change or impending climate changes and environmental degradation. Climate grief or eco-grief is feeling that loss of moment for our natural surroundings due to climate change. Eco-paralysis is feeling as though we can't do anything big enough in the time that we have to address the climate change problem. Eco-guilt is feeling as though we're all perpetrators to the climate change problem, and in reality we are, because climate change mitigation and adaptation actions are not easily accessible to everyone or easy for everyone to take part in, so feeling that sense of guilt. And the last term is solastalgia, feeling as though we're homesick in our home environment because we perceive our home environment to have changed so drastically due to the effects of climate change. And so a study that, or a commentary that a number of us conducted in the Lancet a few years ago, we looked at ecological grief and anxiety and looking at, is this a healthy response to climate change? And again, just noting that grief and anxiety related to climate change are reasonable and functional responses. And increasingly, we're seeing them at the population level, this type of distress related to experiencing or our knowledge of climate change. And we need urgent responses. We need to put families at the forefront because we know that experiences of climate anxiety and climate grief tend to be experienced amongst children and youth who have more time to think about the issue. They're inheriting the problem and the earth, and they have less agency to take action, whether their families are going to engage in climate mitigation or adaptation efforts, whether to fly or to drive to different places, et cetera. So really having that focus on families first, making sure that we have a focus on health equity approaches, because again, we know that those who are at greater risk are those who are on the front lines already experiencing health inequities. We need to ensure that there's mental health care training, so an increased training for professionals on climate change and health. There was a study, I think a year or two ago, of the International Federation of Medical Students, and I think between 7 and 11% of medical students had received any training on climate change and health, and that was predominantly focused on the physical health outcomes, not the mental health outcomes. So we need to make sure that there's training for healthcare providers. We need to enhance clinical assessments and support and making sure that they're culturally relevant and diverse. We need to harness already proven individual and group therapies that can be transferred over to addressing climate-related challenges like eco-anxiety. And increasing social prescribing of activities, time spent in nature. We know that time spent in nature not only improves moods, reduces depression, but also helps to cultivate that relationship between natures and humans where we want to conserve and protect our natural environment. So thinking about how do we cope and adapt with these issues? I was curious about this in my initial research as well. I wanted to have a better understanding of any factors that can influence positive psychosocial adaptation. And I came up with a number of factors that could influence positive psychosocial adaptation. Firstly, and this is not in any specific order, but I'm just going around the circle here, but thinking about enhancing mental health literacy, again, making sure that we live in communities where we can talk openly about our mental health and our mental health needs and to seek care. Training, so mental health care training, making sure that our not only our health practitioners are trained in supporting and triaging mental health care after climate-related events, but also communities are trained in supporting the well-being of their communities through psychological first aid or mental health first aid, that we take a health equity approach, and that at the forefront there's Indigenous leadership and partnership, particularly as we know that those who are on the front line tend to be Indigenous peoples who've experienced intergenerational trauma, colonialism, and the compounding effects of climate change. Government priorities and actions to increase access to mental health care. We need to work across sectors. And then importantly, what came up quite frequently in this research was the importance of social capital and a sense of community. So social capital are the networks and resources of support that we have, and a sense of community is a feeling of belonging. And both social capital and a sense of community are paramount in post-disaster recovery. And in the research, there's often evidence that post-disaster recovery that focuses on building social capital and a sense of community is more important at many times than economic or other types of assistance, is really, again, building that sense of community to promote the wellness. When we think about coping at the individual level, we know that Greta Thunberg is very iconic in this regard for a few reasons, because coping at the individual level can be supported when we are developing or engaging in actions that feel as though we can make a dent in the issue, so feeling as though we have a sense of agency, building a sense of meaning or purpose in one's life, and creating those social connections. So going back to that last slide about that, the importance of belonging and social capital. At the community level, it's very important to put communities first. And again, things that have been very supportive or found to be very supportive in the research include things like increasing the ability for communities to engage in peer-to-peer support through psychological first aid or mental health first aid. A prime example of this is after the 2013 High River, Alberta floods, the community had noted that there was longer-term mental health effects of dealing with the flooding event. And it was a smaller rural community that many people felt reluctant to seek formal mental health care because they knew everyone in the community, they knew where that facility was located, and they felt really stigmatized about entering it. So the community wanted to really open up access to care and to talk about the importance of dealing with community level mental health. So the project was called Safe Spot, and what was done was that community members and businesses, whether it was a local coffee shop or banks or hair salons, they were able to access training in psychological first aid. And once they received that training, they would post an orange dot on the door of the business. And that was to signal that any door is the right door when you're seeking support for your mental health and well-being in the community. And this is tailored off of very similar approaches that took place after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. So thinking about some policy and practice interventions, of course, improving access to mental health care is a chief important component. We also know financial and economic assistance is very important because there are heaps of economic strain after climate-related disasters. Some specific practices that communities can take could be developing community resilience plan that really factor in psychosocial and social well-being, or conducting climate change and health, vulnerability, and adaptation assessments that really factor in the mental health effects and adaptation opportunities. As mentioned before, harnessing medical practices, so specific behavioral cognitive therapies or medications or from mental health care practitioners, and distributing resources on the impacts of climate change to mental health. And of course, individual practices, as mentioned earlier, spending time in nature, connecting with community, and engaging in active transportation. Engaging in active transportation has co-benefits. Not only does it reduce GHG emissions, but it also can improve mood, and reduce depression. So what's taking shape in Canada? So we've seen in the pandemic response a real need to focus and address mental health at the population level when dealing with a global pandemic. And these resources are transferable to supporting mental health in a changing climate. So the Government of Canada launched the Wellness Together platform, which includes the Pocket Well app and the Hope for Wellness helpline. The Hope for Wellness helpline is specific to supporting Indigenous people's experiences of mental health and well-being throughout the pandemic and beyond. There's also the Health Adapt program, which I'm very fortunate to lead at Health Canada, which is a capacity building program where we support health authorities who are conducting climate change and health assessments. One of our funding recipients, Centre Intégré de Santé de Services Sociaux in Chaudière-Appalaches, is leading a pilot project where they're looking at how to prevent the negative impacts on mental health and psychosocial well-being of populations who've been exposed to extreme climate events. And also the National Adaptation Strategy. So in 2020, the Government of Canada committed to developing Canada's first National Adaptation Strategy and Federal Adaptation Action Plan. And of the 5 advisory tables, there's one on health and well-being that includes climate change and mental health considerations. Globally, we're seeing more leadership in terms of integrating mental health more substantively into national climate change and health assessments. There are a whole host of research leads. There are professional psychiatric networks that are focused on not only providing support in terms of addressing experiences of anxiety and grief related to climate change, but also taking action on addressing climate change within their professions. There are policy statements by a number of international and leading organizations and policy briefing papers really calling for action in terms of research funding and support, making sure that there's cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary action to address it, and really working towards reducing climate change through GHG mitigation, and also providing opportunities to look at the co-benefits to mental health. And some new and novel approaches. There's a great book on the right that's really geared towards 20 to 30 somethings about keeping cool on a warming planet and addressing climate anxiety. There are networks of care, nature-based therapies, group-based interventions, spiritual-based interventions, online forums. The list goes on. Every time I do a talk, I add something new because someone has provided me with another new link of some of the great options that are really coming forward. One of the key ones that I want to mention today is the Parks prescription being led by Dr. Melissa Lamb in BC, who is a medical professional who's providing prescriptions to time in nature, because again, we know the importance to connectedness to the natural environment, but also to our mental health and physical health. So with that, I think I've managed to stay within my time. If not, I apologize and wanted to say thank you, and really look forward to the rest of the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayes. Hope you can still hear and possibly see us. That was wonderful, and we'll plod right through to our next speaker, Dr. Paul Vilnev.
Paulie.
Okay, I get a different view up here, but that's great. It is so nice to be back in person and seeing some friendly faces. Thanks for organizing a great event. I've really enjoyed the talk so far. So I'm going to change things just a little bit. Of course, I'm talking about climate change, but I come at it more from an environmental health perspective. So a lot of my background is looking at things like exposure to electromagnetic fields and cancer, and looking at things like air pollution, and looking at things like the health benefits of urban built environments. So of course, a lot of that all relates to climate change as well. Okay, so you've heard of all the different types of ways that climate change can impact us. And, this slide sort of drives a lot of these things home really quickly, especially those of us who've lived without power the last week in Ottawa, the flooding that we've seen throughout Canada over recent years, droughts, and of course, wildfire. So again, a lot of what I'll talk about today is, again, to give you a bit of a flavor of some of the Canadian epidemiological research that's been done on some of these different exposures. Now, one of the ones that received a lot of attention is this issue of extreme heat and hot weather. And we now recognize, of course, that it's a significant threat to human health. And what's also important to remember in Canada is that the rates of these temperature increases are going to be much higher than the global rate in the coming years. So many of you have probably heard those media reports. And, thinking back to Andre Picard's talk earlier today about a 2-degree change or 1.5 degree, again, we're talking about a mean change. So those of you who've taken stats and know shapes of distributions, that also shifts the number of extreme events that you're going to get. And we all heard of the summer of 2021 last year, the heat wave that affected British Columbia, floods as well too, large loss of wildlife, and that led to 740 deaths in the province of British Columbia. And we've also seen a number of heat waves and illnesses in other provinces. And what's important to keep in mind is that some of these impacts of extreme heat can actually happen on the same day or over the successive days that come. So I pulled this from the Government of Canada report, and I think this really drives home what's going to be happening over the next 50 years. And I don't want to be all doom and gloom, as some people have sort of described. We should be a little bit wary of, but I still think it's important to get out some of these statistics so that people are aware of what's coming and they can begin to shape policy. So one of the things that I take from this as well, yeah, it would be nice to live in Victoria, I guess, over the next 100 years. But you look at a place like Windsor and you look at what's going to be happening in 40 and 50 years. You're talking about 70 days in a given year where you're going to have a temperature above 30 degrees. That's huge compared to what was happening between 1961 and 1990. So we're lucky here in Canada. We have access to great databases across the country, provincial health administrative data sets. So we can actually begin to get information from things like physician prescriptions, emergency room visits for cardiovascular disease, for asthma, so on. And there's been some studies that have been coming out over the last few years that have started to show some of these dramatic increases in things like pediatric admissions in Southern Ontario, 22% increase. We've also found some links with mental health outcomes, suicide risks. I'll show you some results of a recent meta-analysis that we did. And then there's been work from people at Health Canada and Public Health Ontario that has shown that as we get into these extreme heat days, there's increased risk of hospitalization for cardiovascular disease and stroke. And you'll see the shape of this curve taken from the Wilk paper is that when these events tend to happen is you see this increase in risk in the subsequent days that follow, and then it sort of goes back to normal. So this is a meta-analysis that Brianna Frangione did with my group last year, and Brianna has just graduated from health sciences, but she did a meta-analysis of 26 studies and showed that a 1% increase in daily temperature would increase the suicide risk by 1.6%. And this is taken from studies all around the world. There's some regional variations, there's some variations between men and women, but this just goes to show you how much a sudden change in temperature can impact stress and an outcome as serious as suicide. What I'd also like to point out too is we've been doing some work where we've shown some relationships between day-to-day changes in air pollution and suicide risk in Canada over the last 15 years, and we've seemed to find a similar association with air pollution as well too. Now, all of you have seen the pictures. California, British Columbia, the forest fires. We all know they're going to get worse and worse and worse. What we often forget is that these exposures can impact the soil, they can impact the water, they can impact indoor environments. The PM 2.5, the fine particulate matter, air pollution from forest fires can infiltrate inside. Forest fires contain a number of carcinogens, benzene, formaldehyde, PAHs. So not only do we have to worry about short-term health effects from these forest fires, but we also have to worry about some of the longer-term effects. So here's a work that was published a few years ago, and this summarizes some of the acute mortality risks. So what I mean by this is you're being exposed to the exposure from forest fires, and over the next few days, what is the change in risk? So in this paper, I thought very well done. They analyzed 749 wildfires worldwide. I shouldn't put two W words together, but anyways, so they looked at 750 wildfires around the world, and you can see the patterns. They see a strong relationship with all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, respiratory mortality in the first few days following the forest fire. And they estimated 0.62% of all-cause deaths were due to forest fires. So you might think 0.62, that's a pretty small number. But when you think of all deaths, and you think of how infrequently, I don't know if I would say that word any more, that wildfires occur, that's a large public health impact. So there's this great paper that came out just a couple weeks ago from a group in McGill. It was looking at data from the Canadian census cohort. So again, this is a great source of data we have here in Canada. People who fill out the long-form census, about 20% of households, and they do it every 5 years. What Stats Canada has done is they've linked this entire database, millions and millions of people going back to 1991, to national mortality and cancer incidence data. And what this group in Montreal did is just great. They went back over time because with this database, you can identify the postal code of where these people lived and where they lived over time. And they were able to identify forest fires within 20 or 50 kilometers of these people's homes. And what you see here is they found that those who lived within a forest fire that was 50 kilometers or less, that they had a 5% increased risk of lung cancer and a 10% higher risk of brain cancer compared to those who weren't nearby forest fires. And again, so this kind of highlights the impacts from a long-term exposure. And they produce this really nice visual that sort of shows, these are people from the Canadian census cohort. So it's not maps of forest fires, but it's maps of the people that are in the study population. And if you look at 1986 to 1990, and you look at 2011 to 2015, you see how many more of these people are being exposed to forest fires. So this is a really striking image, really good work by the team out of McGill. So getting into some other types of epidemiological studies, again, Fort McMurray's come up again. The 2016 wildfires, they got hammered again with the flooding in 2020. I think it was a Canadian Press story the year of 2016, the wildfires. So what this group did was they collected impacts of wildfire, flooding, and COVID-19 on these various mental health outcomes, anxiety, depression, PTSD. And what I take from this is that as we begin to get exposed to more and more of these stressors, that the risk of these outcomes, these adverse mental health outcomes, increase much more strongly. So some of the epidemiological considerations for assessing health impacts of climate change in Canadians. And this has come up a little bit earlier today about survey studies, use of health administrative data. You know, the survey studies, I think, become really important because you can get into the community and you can collect qualitative information that you can't get from administrative data. The problem becomes people who are often most affected are reticent to participate in these studies. So that introduces a lot of problems, potential biases. So this is why time series studies or cohort studies, longitudinal designs, if you can get them up and running, can become a little bit more powerful. Most regions in Canada, most provinces, you can link health data. You can link prescription drug to hospitalization, to mortality, to cancer data. So this provides a lot of opportunities in this country that other countries just aren't able to do. Another important thing, and just going back to the wildfire studies, for example, we need to be able to assess both the short-term and the longer-term impacts from some of these exposures. And some of these events have just happened over the last few years, so it'll be 10 years, 15 years before we can begin to fully understand some of the trajectories. Other things that we're trying to do is develop some of these exposure surfaces across Canada. So we're able to link things to postal codes, link these exposure data into epidemiological data sets. So some of the things from a climate change perspective that we care about, a wildfire smoke, urban heat island effects, tree canopies. And we also need evidence-based findings on evaluating some of these health impacts on different types of interventions that can mitigate some of these harmful exposures. And last but not least, this has come up before, is looking at some of the effects of inequities, social determinants of health, and urban and rural differences. So this is a group that I'm part of, and what we're doing is we've created this large data platform, and it has things like noise, air pollution, temperature, marginalization indices, and we've created all these measures for all the postal codes across Canada, and we're enhancing it with things like wildfire smoke. We're creating this healthy design tool where we can go into a neighborhood and look at all the built environment features and almost score the neighborhood in terms of how healthy it is. You've all heard of like the walk score, how walkable a neighborhood is. So this is kind of an analogy to that, but incorporating all these environmental exposures. And of course, those of you who know me well know that one of the things that I've gotten into over maybe the last 10 years is looking at the benefits of greenness, because I don't want it to always be doom and gloom. So when you think of greenness, it provides so many of these environmental benefits, reducing heat island effects. It can shelter kids from UV radiation, buffer against environmental noise. It can also help mitigate flooding from stormwater. And of course, those of us who like to plant gardens, or I try, but I can never get anything to grow, it provides some benefits that way too. And here, I won't go into the 50 shades of greens, all these different pathways, but there's a number of them whereby greenness can impact environmental exposures, which can in turn impact a large number of health outcomes in a very positive way. And this is one of the studies we've just published over the last few months. We've shown that if we look at residential measures of greenness, that they can help reduce levels of depression, but we tend to see better associations or stronger benefits among those with lower income. So greenness can actually provide an important opportunity for reducing some of these different social disparities in health outcomes. And we've also looked at a number of outcomes like births, mortality rates, and there's also some benefits of greenness for that. So I'll talk briefly about the Central Experimental Farm study that we've done, because this has sort of reached the news here in Ottawa again too, with the development of the Civic Hospital and moving on to experimental farmland, building a large parking garage, so on and so on. So about 4 or 5 years ago, a group of students here, they actually drove around for a couple weeks, and they took measures of air pollution, noise, temperature, and they began to map out some of it. So I think having this kind of information can be really helpful for guiding local politicians, policymakers. And what we ended up showing was that the temperature around the urban green space, around the Central Experimental Farm, was much lower. It helped mitigate some of the urban heat island effects in the summertime. And we also showed that it had lower levels of air pollution as well. And so this is just a quick snapshot taken from one of the infographic. Of course, there's many seasonal differences in some of these exposures. But again, it just sort of went to show that there's a lot of environmental benefits with respect to climate change that we can get from urban green spaces. So I'm going to highlight a couple research gaps, I think, before I close out. One of the ones is that there's very few studies of workers. I know there's a couple efforts to sort of look at workers impacted by climate change, firefighters and so on, outdoor workers, but we still need a lot more. We haven't followed up a lot of these cohorts over time. We need more intervention studies to figure out how to best mitigate the impacts of a changing climate. I know some people have looked at different species of trees, what is best for helping to mitigate against extreme temperatures. One of the things we're thinking of getting into over the next 6 months is measuring what the impact is on exposures for passengers for those who take an electric bus versus a diesel bus. So collecting all this information can help shape policies and can give evidence to local representatives to make some more of these changes. And I think one of the other things we need to do is we need to do a lot better in terms of monitoring some of these exposures in rural places. And one of the challenges for us is that if you go to a rural place, the postal code becomes a lot bigger area. As opposed to in a city, one postal code is essentially like, one side of a street between two intersecting streets. So it's got a much finer resolution. So this creates some challenges in urban areas. And so the last thing I'd say is, and I like Michael Datter and the cartoons he draws, I think it's incumbent upon all of us, really, not just to talk the talk, but to actually get engaged, as Andre Picard said, to be relentless, to look for opportunities for funding, look for research programs can actually help guide policy, And because ultimately, I think that we can only do so much ourselves, and we really need the evidence to help shape policies by those who can make them. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, and don't go away too fast. We've got some time for some questions. We do have some that are online, and Dr. Abizaid is going to moderate the questions from the floor, so I'll give him the mic. But first, I think this is a good question, Paul, and I think this is one that has percolated in the back of my brain after hearing all the stories, and this is from one of our persons watching online, asking, how would you recommend increasing awareness towards climate change on the policy and science that's communicated? There's a big gap on how both fields are perceived, and how do we fix this? And I think you sort of were alluding to this towards the end. Andre touched on this. I think we all kind of feel this, right? That we know the science, and we're aware of the impact, and some of your work very nicely shows, when you can intervene with green space, you can mitigate some of the impact. But it seems like there's this gap between communicating that and actually enacting change, right? So, you spoke a bit about it, but perhaps even Katie joining in online could answer as well. But what else can we do to shout loudly, right? And how do we get this information to the politicians and the people making the decisions about how our city becomes further urbanized? Well, I think you can use one of these mics down here, potentially. Yeah.
Is it on?
Yeah, there you go. See, look at that.
Well, I think there's a number of different ways that you can approach it. And I think one of the things that I try to do is at the outset of the study, I try to engage a number of people in the projects. And I'll reach out to people, say, in Ottawa Public Health, or I'll work with Health Canada, because then you get your findings communicated through those agencies as well, too. And a lot of times they can carry the message. So I think that's step one. I think another thing one can do too is you look for opportunities. You think about, say, features of the urban built environment, like they're always changing all the time, right? So there's these natural interventions that come up, and neighborhoods care about it, and residents of a community care about it. And I think sort of getting out there and being aware of them and getting, ready to hit the ground running becomes really important. And then the other thing I'd say is, getting students involved in the projects, because they tend to be passionate than some of us older folks, and they get everyone else engaged. And I think it just kind of energizes everyone a little bit. So that's kind of how I approach it.
Any questions? Well, while people think of a question, I do have a question for any of the speakers, really. Can people hear me? Yes. But perhaps Katie can give us an answer to this. There is talk in all three of these presentations about ways to cope, right? In some ways, those coping mechanisms come from different perceptions of a particular threat. Others involve social support, the community support that Paul just alluded to, and that Katie alluded to as well, the sort of grassroots movements when something happens, right? But how can we better prepare? Because climate change is not going to change after this conference, unfortunately. But how can we get people ready? How can the young people here, change that state of mind and prepare for potential disasters? I know it's a very general question, but is there ways in which communities can prepare or information can be given to them so that they can prepare better?
I can take a stab at this. Thanks for the question. It is quite large, but definitely thinking when we talk about coping and how people adapt to it, there's no one size fits all that's going to work for anyone, particularly when we're talking about our mental health. So I think that is one piece to be aware of. But there are strategies in place, and just as you mentioned about being prepared. So, largely we're seeing a lot of public health units across the country who are working on these climate change and health vulnerability and adaptation assessments to understand the risks and to understand the adaptation opportunities. But then going back to the earlier question about communicating that, it's great when we have these really fantastic scientific reports, but then how do you mobilize the knowledge? And thinking about Dr. Ed Maybach, who I believe Andre Picard had mentioned earlier on, he really stresses the importance of repeating simple messages frequently and from trusted voices. So knowing that the trusted voices are, often from health practitioners, that really need to make sure that we're broadcasting the type of risk, but we're also immediately pairing the risks with the adaptation opportunities that can take place. We saw a lot of this coming out of COVID, the importance of talking about the risks of COVID, and then what can individuals do to protect themselves? What are the simple steps that we can do? Wash our hands, stay 6 feet apart, wear masks, etc. The same kind of communication needs to occur when we're talking about climate change, because we know that the messages that we're hearing about climate change are alarming. And what that can do for many people who are already experiencing anxiety and stress can put them, to peak anxiety and peak stress. We need to make sure that how we're communicating about it is that, yes, there are indeed risks, and here are some opportunities to keep your community well. Knowing where the mental health resources are that can support you, knowing where your emergency kits are available, and also including in those emergency kits things that keep you well, whether that's a journal, whether for children it's a beloved toy, those types of things, to really make sure that we are creating actions around the type of risks that we're identifying. So those are kind of the key pieces that can be identified, and also just having general awareness of translating and mobilizing that knowledge that's created in these large climate change and health assessments and moving that towards action.
So I have a question about just the environment and sort of health, thinking about that together. So like in regards to when you think about like building code or like zoning laws, and how the built environment gets decided upon to be developed this way or that way, or whether there's green spaces or not, and what's allowed to be crunched together, what's not allowed, and then how that interacts with social dynamics, economic dynamics, like sort of the synergy between all the stakeholders, and then coming back to climate change and health. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think it becomes such an important topic. I think in many ways, a lot of the European cities are ahead of us. If you look at cities like many in the Netherlands, like in Copenhagen, their cities are designed for active transportation, for cycling. Barcelona's instituted some great things where there has to be so much green space and parks nearby, and these super blocks that are really conducive to all that. And I think one of the things that we haven't done well here in Canada is that there's so much urban sprawl, and in the US as well. And I think part of that as a function is we just have so much land that, it becomes the easiest way to do things, right? And I think, unfortunately, we're caught in a situation where we kind of maybe have to double track or rethink about how we do that. But that would ultimately be my hope, is that we create communities that foster more of this active transportation and walking to the grocery stores and walkable communities and all that, because there are so many different benefits that come with it.
I'm not used to talking through a microphone, sorry. One thing that all of this kind of points to, and it's unfortunate Dr. King had to leave, but I feel like there's still this big emphasis on your like personal responsibility. So it sounds like, you are personally responsible for the things you're doing to, help prevent climate change. You're personally responsible for your mental health. And then now it's like, oh, you have to make sure you're resilient if you're planning to have children, because there might be a climate disaster when you're pregnant. And it's just like it's very frustrating, because, the answer I feel like everyone gives us to make our government make change is like, we'll go out and vote. It's like, okay, I go out and I vote. I live in an NDP area. That's great. I know that my NDP person is going to get up in there and try to make some change, but there's all these other areas. There's a lot of people that, not to be too political, but like vote for Doug Ford, and he's not going to do anything to improve our mental health services in Ontario. So what is happening at the government level? What is happening at the institutional level, and how can we push that forward so it's not just always on us to be the people to make sure that we're prepared for everything when we don't have support from the institutions around us to help us do that?
Yeah, it's $1 million question. My daughter and I were talking last week, and she's 13, and we were talking about climate change, and she said, "Dad, whatever I do is going to be a drop in the bucket. It's not going to. What you really need are, the local representative, the local government, and the provincial and the federal. Like all of them need to do more. And that's not to say we shouldn't do anything, right? Because there are ways that we can reduce our own footprint, and those become important. But I think it comes back to sort of trying to be a little relentless and keeping this on people's radar and saying, well, no, I want a city that's going to be built this way. I want to be able to walk to a park, and I want to make this a campaign issue. But I think it's something that all of us kind of struggle with, the frustration of, some governments want to, build a new highway over parkland, and claiming that helps climate change. It's kind of like, how completely, utterly tone deaf can you be? So anyways, I don't want to get too political either, but I think it's a frustration shared by a lot of people, and providing the evidence and raising it as an issue, I think, is what we need to keep doing.
Katie, do you want to provide any other answers to that or add a comment?
Yeah, I can just say again, as I noted in the presentation, one of the big things that is occurring right now is the National Adaptation Strategy that the federal government is working on, and also a subsequent federal adaptation action plan. And really seeing, in my own work, where I work with health authorities who are doing climate change and health assessments, and the importance of them doing that work and then mobilizing that at the regional, provincial, territorial levels as well, to create those shifts. But again, still coming up against challenges, making sure that the decision makers are seeing those things, particularly in public health, because we know that after the last 2+ years, the focus in public health has really been on responding to COVID. And so a lot of what we talk about is how do we ensure that the actions and the activities that can address climate change have co-benefits in dealing with different public health issues. How do we make sure that we're looking at COVID response, response to the opioid crisis, and addressing climate change and health? So what are some of the activities that are transferable amongst all of these things that can support our communities? So that's a big ask and a big task, and no one has quite nailed it on the head yet, but it is really taking that comprehensive, holistic approach to understanding the challenges that we face and the opportunities to address a multitude of things. So, in particular, the importance of, active transportation, as was mentioned, reducing obesity, moods, and also the benefits of reducing GHG emissions.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you again to our wonderful panel. Again, it's too bad Dr. King had to take off and do another talk, but that's how in demand she is. But I don't know about you, but I have a lot to think about, and great questions from the audience and lots to think over lunch. So on that note, there is an amazing spread of food outside. We also have the Nat Geo exhibit, right? So take a look at some of the images if you haven't had a chance yet. If we can pop the brainstorming questions back up on the slide, just to, again, get your juices flowing. If you want to jot some notes down on a sticky note and put them up on our board in the atrium, I invite you to do that as well. Take this opportunity to network as long as you feel comfortable. Keep your masks on until we're eating and so on. I also want to lure you back. Make sure we come back for 1 p.m. for another fantastic session on a planetary health approach to climate change. At 2:30, we will do a draw for AirPods. Okay, so come on back. You could win some AirPods. We'll keep talking and turn talk into action with our closing remarks as well. So thanks for a great morning session. And not to forget as well, the Zen Zone. There will be some beautiful music being played, something called handpan. I'm learning lots of things today. But if you want to come zen out, they will be live on Zoom. So. Oh, okay. You can practice with a musician. There you go. So we'll from stress to chill. Okay. Have a great lunch.